Who knew I'd grow up to be the dean's homework? So thank you so much for inviting me. It's an incredible honor. It's also really funny to be standing here. I was probably not voted most likely to give a commencement address when I graduated here in 1984. I was a kind of punky, marginal kid who wanted to do kind of what I'm doing, and everyone else wanted to be on the front page of the New York Times doing hardcore reporting. And, not that I haven't done reporting, but I've got kind of essayistic. So I remember someone here told me if I didn't take business reporting, I'd never amount to anything. And I didn't take business reporting, and it seems to have sort of worked out. I also want to assure you, maybe you won't get jobs, maybe you'll get a job, but I haven't actually had a job since 1988. I got hired, despite the lack of business reporting, I got hired just before I graduated at an art magazine. I left that job in 1988, and I keep meaning to get another job, but I've been really busy, so I haven't gotten around to it. The field we're in is changing so rapidly, it's hard to anticipate where anybody's going to end up, and I think that we all improvise our way forward. The poet Antonio Machado once said, "Walker, there is no path. The path is made by walking." I think that's the career most of us are signing up for. So I might be giving you advice now. So keep walking, check your compass, maybe your moral compass. I'm also really grateful to come here. I've been crediting this place ever since I graduated for being really important to my writing. I'm the kind of writer who now might go to an MFA program and do creative nonfiction, one of the worst phrases in the English language. And, and coming here, there was a really kind of hardcore nuts and bolts, like you don't have writer's block, you have a deadline, just do it anyway. Another big motto of mine. And I got grounding in the things that you really have to write non-fictional anything. Principles and resourcefulness, and maybe three things, good lead lines. The principles came from a pervasive bottom line that when you're telling true stories, you have a responsibility to your subject, your readers, and the historical record to get things right and not distort, omit, exaggerate through laziness or inattention or corrupt versions of creativity. Ben Bagdikian, who gave a fantastic class on ethics for journalists when I was here, is where the principles here came from most directly in my time. I know the school mourns his recent death. I know he's still with the profession in many ways. I know he was lucky to be in his class where he taught us, you can't be objective, but you can be fair. Objective is a fiction that there's some neutral ground, some political no man's land you can hang out in. You and the mainstream media, who I often think they actually are hanging out in this non-existent place. So even what you deem worthy to report, who you quote, is a political decision. The details you ignore, the details you include. We tend to treat people on the fringe as political, as though the decision to not own a car is political and the decision to own and use a car is not. As though to support the status quo when it, say, upheld slavery 160 years ago, or in the present uphold fossil fuel corporations' right to destroy is neutral, and to oppose these things is not. But there is no neutral ground, and your job is to not only report the story, but to break the story. This has two meanings. Break the story, as you know, is an old term journalists use to mean getting a scoop, being the first to tell something. But for me, the phrase has had a deeper resonance for a long time. When you report on any event, no matter how large or small, a presidential election, a school board meeting, you're supposed to come back with a story about what just happened. But of course, we all swim in stories like fish swim in water. We breathe them in, we breathe them out. The art of being fully conscious in personal life means seeing the story and becoming its teller, rather than letting it be the unseen force that tells you what to do. Becoming a public storyteller requires the same skills with larger consequences and responsibilities, because your story becomes part of that water we all swim in together, undermines or reinforces the existing stories. Your job is to report on the story on the surface, the contained story, the one you can write yourself, the one that happened yesterday. But it's also to see and make visible and even to challenge the ambient stories, the stories that are already written, the stories that are in our bones and our blood and all of our systems. There are stories beneath the stories and around the stories. The recent event on the surface is often merely the hood ornament on the mighty social engine that is a story driving the culture. We call these dominant narratives or paradigms or memes or metaphors we live by or frameworks. They are immensely powerful forces. And the dominant culture mostly goes about reinforcing the stories that are the pillars propping it up, the bones of its anatomy, and too often the bars of somebody else's cage. They are too often stories that should be broken, or already broken and ruined and ruinous, and way past their expiration date. They sit atop mountains of unexamined assumptions. Why do we talk about terrorism so much, which kills so few Americans, and talk so little about domestic violence, which terrorizes millions of women over extended periods and kills about 1,200 of us a year? Why don't we even have a term for that familicide, that mass killing in which a man, often white, often middle class, often the status quo incarnate, takes out his whole family? Why is it so little known that a great many mass shootings are actually just domestic violence supernovaing? How do you break the story about what really threatens and kills us and what is actually a kind of peripheral problem? Part of your job, if you want to be a great journalist, a great storyteller, a great contributor, is to examine these, to make them visible, and often to break us free of them, to break the story. Breaking is a creative act as much as making in this kind of writing. Lots of writers have mooned around saying the world is made out of stories, as though this is a lovely thing, but it's only as lovely as the stories. There are stories about racial inferiority, stories that demonize female anger and black anger, and revere white male rage, which is running for president again, incidentally, as it has for a long time. There are stories about the inevitability of capitalism, stories that are two sides to the reality of climate change. And then there are a host of stories that don't get told because they rock the boat, discomfort the powerful, unsettle the status quo. These are the stories you're being sent forth to tell this lovely May Day. Stories that will make you unpopular with some people it's really great to be unpopular with. And beloved by others, it's even greater to be beloved by. Stories that matter, the stories that change the world, often move from the margins to the center. And you can see people. There's the famous thing Gandhi didn't actually say, since attributing quotes correctly is really important. First they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. Journalism has a role in that. My friend Chip Ward, a great journalist I'm going to see in Utah next week, talked about how stories often emerge with activists, with people who are considered marginal, and then some edgy reporter at a small place will report on that. And there's a whole food chain before the mainstream media gets over its inevitable unending timidity to kind of confirm that this is now an accepted reality, that the police kill a lot of people and it's not justified, that, and things like that. And so, 11 years ago this August, a triple disaster struck New Orleans. The hurricane was the least of it. The failure of infrastructure and decades of bad planning and worse implementation made it an accurately foreseen, largely man-made disaster, deepened by failures of the social contract. Poor people, mostly people of color in a 2/3 black city, were left behind to drown and suffer. Then the mass media showed up to criminalize people trying to survive and obsess about the possibility that someone might be stealing a TV set, making it clear that they considered the sanctity of TV sets more important than rescuing dying grandmothers and traumatized toddlers. They fell back on a clutch of cliches that were already well known when the 1906 earthquake happened here in San Francisco. It was in fact because I'd just been doing research and writing on those 6 earthquakes, and I'd gotten interested in disasters generally, and investigated the work of the disaster sociologists who upended, as the dean was mentioning, everything people think they know about disasters, that I was fairly well equipped to be skeptical about the narratives of mobs of raping, looting, murdering humans gone savage. They weren't true in 1906, and they weren't true in 2005, even though The Guardian, The New York Times, The Washington Post, NBC, I may be allergic to the dominant narrative. So the NBC, CBS, CNN, and the rest reported on them. Adam Hochschild spoke last week about his new book, and he said that journalists tend to travel in herds and report the same story. And it's talking about the Spanish Civil War, but it was true of this as much. Don't be a herd animal, whatever you do. If there's a herd over there, somebody's already got the story, and there's some story somebody's not getting. I wrote in Harper's for the 10th anniversary of the catastrophe. A vast population of mostly African-American New Orleanians was trapped on rooftops, elevated freeways, and the convention center and Superdome in the sweltering 80% underwater city, demonized by government and mainstream media as too savage and dangerous to rescue or allowed to leave the city. Would-be rescuers from outside were turned back by officials, as were people attempting to flee from inside. New Orleans had, at the hand of malevolent authorities, become a prison city. Given how the people of Baltimore were demonized for rising up last April, and how chain stores and predatory check cashing outlet suddenly became the holiest of holy sites for many Americans, it's easy to imagine another disaster like it. The unindicted co-conspirator in this dehumanization, imprisonment, and death of so many people, mostly African Americans, many of them elderly in New Orleans, was and is the mass media, the mainstream media. They fell back on the usual disaster stories about looting, raping, marauding hordes, eager to demonize Black people as monsters who are enemies, rather than as the vulnerable, needy victims of a catastrophe. They invented news stories that turn out to be entirely baseless about people shooting at helicopters and great piles of corpses from imaginary bloodbaths in the Superdome. So these were broken stories, or stories that needed to be broken. I realized as I kept returning to New Orleans after Katrina that not only had many untrue stories been told over and over and over until people who should know better believed them, but there had in fact been horrific crimes, including a number of murders, that the armies of reporters swamping the city had utterly avoided or been unable to perceive. These were the crimes not of the underclass against the status quo, but of the status quo against the underclass. Police killings, white vigilantes killing Black people. I gathered up a bunch of evidence and was not really quite equipped to do that kind of intense investigative journalism. Handed a lot of it over to my friend A.C. Thompson, who works with Lowell Bergman, is part of the Center for Investigative Reporting in ProPublica. It's won almost every journalism award there is for his work on Katrina, and went in and just was kind of like a one-man mop-up operation. The Times-Picayune, the local paper, finally reported the stories of the real crimes because A.C. was there. The FBI followed him around like he was the Pied Piper and kind of like built their own cases. The Department of Justice indicted a bunch of people. People actually went to prison because of what he did. And it was really amazing. And I felt at some point we had committed to break the story of Hurricane Katrina. And I had this, and I did my own work. I put out A Paradise Built in Hell. I've been writing about disasters ever since. And there's this crazy, amazing moment when I came out of a radio station where I'd been talking about what really happened a few years after the disaster. And I turned on my car radio, and AC was on a whole different station doing the same thing. I thought, we actually broke that story. The writer's job is not to look through the window someone else built, but to step outside or question the framework or dismantle the house and free what's inside, all in service of making visible what's locked out of the view. It's a tendency of journalism to focus on what changed yesterday rather than to ask what are the underlying forces and who are the unseen beneficiaries of this moment's status quo. A policeman shoots a Black man. What do you need to know besides the specific facts about how often this happens, or why it happens, or how it affects communities in the long term? This is why you need to know your history, even if you're a journalist. You need to know the patterns, see how people are fitting the jumble of facts into familiar patterns, and make your own fair but not neutral assessment of the way this fits into the pattern or not. Think big, go deep, open it up for everyone. The world is made out of stories. When you remake the stories, you remake the world. UVA media scholar Siva Vaidhanathan noted last week, how much play would an op-ed writer get for writing conservative attacks on academic freedom on the rise on campus, or liberal support for free speech rampant on campus? Because both these things are actually true for those of us who live and work in these environments. Some of the stories we need to break are not exceptional events. They're the ugly wallpaper to our everyday lives, so familiar hardly anyone notices or questions it. For example, there's a widespread belief that women lie about being raped. Not a few women, not anomalous women, but women in general. This framework comes from the assumption that reliability and credibility are as natural to men as mendacity and vindictiveness are to women, that men are frequently punished even for baseless accusations, and women are not punished for lying to the law. In other words, that feminists just made up all this unfairness and violence stuff, because otherwise we have to question a really big story whose nickname is patriarchy. I actually looked into the question of lies and rapes, and you know who totally lies about rape? Rapists. I've never read a story about how often rapists lie about rape, but they do routinely. It's probably approaches pretty close to 100%. There's a truism about news that man bites dog is news, as dog bites man is not. But what if we never even reported on dog bites? What if people had denied for decades that dogs actually bite or even have teeth? Rape is like this, with every story that discredits the idea that rape is a widespread problem, trumpeted from the rooftops, and the massive confirming evidence of this dismissed, discredited, or never brought to the fore in the first place. Thus, one badly misreported rape story at University of Virginia, the notorious Rolling Stone piece in late 2014, was obsessively covered, treated, and then picked up by the popular culture as evidence of general falsity in rape reports. While the fact that the school had so many incidences of rape and so severe a problem with rapes that weren't redressed by the authorities, as they're obliged to do under Title IX, that it was under federal investigation was hardly ever even mentioned. And thus was a false story, a broken story, built up and reconfirmed by layers and layers of bad journalism and mistelling of the truth. I actually looked into the false rape accusation thing, which hardly anybody has ever reported. There's one false report that gets cited all the time that gives really high numbers. The reliable statistics suggest about 2 to 6% of rape reports are false, which means that 94 to 98% are real. But a false rape report doesn't actually mean that somebody accused somebody of rape. So the category people obsess over seems to be in the really tiny single digits, and we don't actually have any evidence for it. Of course, when I was writing about this, my friend Astra Taylor, a great documentary filmmaker, pointed out the most dramatic incidences of false rape reports in this country's history were when white men had falsely accused black men of assaulting white women, which means that you need to reshuffle the deck of who lies about what, for whose benefit. So there's so many broken stories out there. I think of the mainstream media as having not so much a right or left bias, but a status quo bias, a tendency to believe people in authority, to trust institutions and corporations and the rich and powerful, and pretty much any white man in a suit. To let people who've been proven to tell more lies that get reported without questioning, to move forward on cultural assumptions that are readily disproven, and to devalue nearly outsiders, whether they're discredited or mocked or trivialized or just ignored. Thus, the go-alongs with the weapons of mass destruction stories that resulted in hundreds of thousands of deaths in Iraq and the so-called global war on terror. Thus, the pretense that the fossil fuel corporation-funded climate denial represented a legitimate position to be given equal time to the consensus of scientists. Thus, the lack of critical scrutiny of the pretensive climate conspiracies. Really, tell us how every scientist on Earth got paid off, and how those who claim that it's so explain that process. So then climate change, for me, is the biggest elephant in the room, although even that's a bad metaphor. It's not the elephant, it's the whole room and everything in it, because everything else on Earth is inside the biosphere, is inside climate change, which will change everything. And here I think the broken story, the bad reporting, is the lack of coverage of it, the lack of the scope of it, the lack of attention to the impact of this. This is what the Earth was going to look like for the rest of history, not human history, but forever. Species are going to go extinct. Oceans are going to rise. Every atlas they've ever made of the world is going to become outdated in the next 50 to 100 years. Everything is going to change. The weather's going to change. Large parts of the Earth may become uninhabitable. There's going to be mass famines. And the impact of these stories, the death of coral reefs, which nurture fish, are fish incubators that produce the fish that feed about 1 billion people on Earth. You know, these are human interest stories about famine, about displacement, about the way the rich refuse to change a profitable system, having decided that the trade-off in which the poor die is okay by them. These are extraordinary stories and changes on a scale that's made this the Anthropocene era, an era in which human beings are the great force shaping nature or misshaping nature itself. It's been grossly underreported and misreported for decades, and it turns out we thought we only knew about it from the 1980s. We now know the fossil fuel companies knew about it decades earlier, thanks to fantastic reporting by the LA Times and Inside Climate News, which they didn't get nearly enough prizes for. So, future generations are going to curse us for fiddling with trivial stories as the planet burned. And so, we makers and breakers of stories are tremendously powerful. Please, make stories of your own and break the stories that are there. And congratulations.